The envelope contained the deed to Ashmore Hall and a debt of £4,000, and nothing else. Marlowe Vane read it twice, standing in a solicitor's office that smelled of damp wool and burnt tallow, and when she had finished reading, she folded the paper along its original crease and placed it in her satchel with the same deliberate hand she used for everything. The solicitor, a Mr. Fenwick, watched her do this from behind his desk. He was a small man with the particular habit of touching the knot of his cravat whenever he was uncomfortable, and he touched it now. Across the room, near the door, stood a second man, taller, still, dressed in charcoal wool with no ornament, his hands at his sides and his expression carrying the careful neutrality of a person who has already decided an outcome and is merely waiting for the subject to acknowledge it. This was the Duke of Ashmore, the present one, not the one who had died 3 weeks prior and left Marlowe Vane everything he owned in one county and owed in another. The present one was a cousin, and his name was Lord Caelan Ashmore, and he had been in the room when Marlowe arrived, and had not introduced himself. He had simply looked at her, the plain dark coat, the leather satchel with its brass clasp worn thin, the hair pinned without ceremony, and then looked away, in the manner of a man confirming a prior estimate. She had noted this, as she noted all things, and had not remarked upon it. "The hall requires considerable restoration," Fenwick said. He touched his cravat again. "The late Duke was, in his final years, not attentive to maintenance." "I am aware," Marlowe said. "There is also the matter of the inventory." Fenwick produced a second document, a bound ledger of perhaps 40 pages, its cover water-stained, its corners soft with handling. Conducted in the year prior to His Grace's death by Mr. Aldous Crewe, the estate agent. It represents a full accounting of all fixtures, furnishings, and articles of value. Marlowe accepted the ledger. She opened it to a middle page and spent a moment reading. Her face disclosed nothing. "You have had an opportunity to review the contents," Lord Ashmore said from his position near the door. It was the first time he had spoken. His voice was even and unhurried, the voice of a man who does not need to raise it. "I assume they are as expected." "I will conduct my own survey," Marlowe said. A small silence followed. Fenwick's hand moved toward his cravat. "The inventory was prepared by a qualified agent," Lord Ashmore said. "Yes," Marlowe said. "I understand that." She looked at him then, not a challenge, not a performance of patience, simply a steady attention of the kind she gave to a problematic piece before she had yet determined what was wrong with it. He met her eyes. He had expected something else from them, apparently. Whatever he had expected, the look she returned did not provide it. He was the one who looked away first, and this fact, small as it was, entered no record and changed nothing, and Marlowe picked up her satchel and the old ledger and followed Fenwick to the door. Outside, November rain struck the cobblestones with a sound like distant applause. Marlowe stood on the step for a moment before opening her umbrella, and in that moment she was aware, without turning, that Lord Ashmore was watching her from the window. She did not look back. She did not need to. She had worked with inherited objects long enough to understand that value is rarely found where it has been declared, and that the first person to insist an inventory is complete is usually the person who decided what would be left out of it. She walked toward the coaching office. The rain closed behind her. The hall was 11 miles north and she had never seen it. But she knew Crewe's name, had known it for 3 years, and this was the particular knowledge she kept to herself, flat and cool and patient, the way a good provenance document is kept, not displayed, not discarded, simply held until the moment it becomes necessary. I want to take a moment here, before we go further, to say thank you for settling in with this story. If you have found your way to this corner of the channel, you are exactly the kind of listener this story was written for. Someone who understands that the most important things move slowly and are never announced. What follows is a story about a woman who knows what things are truly worth, a house that has been quietly robbed for years, and a man who must learn the difference between stillness and surrender. I would love to know, before we begin in earnest, have you ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better? Leave your answer in the comments when the story is done. Ashmore Hall stood on a rise above a river that had, in better decades, reflected the hall back to itself with some flattery. In November it reflected nothing but gray sky and the shapes of leafless elms. Marlowe arrived in a hired trap at 2:30 in the afternoon, and the driver, a man of few words who had many opinions about the road, pulled up at the iron gate and declined to go further. The gate was unlocked but resistant, its hinges so thickly rusted that opening it required both of her hands and a full minute of sustained effort. She left it open behind her and walked the drive alone. The gravel had long since sunk into the mud. The box hedges that lined the approach were not dead, but they were resentful, grown thick and formless, reaching into the path from both sides, so that she arrived at the front steps with her coat brushed damp on both sleeves. The steps themselves were sound. She noted this. Stone, she thought, not brick, and laid in a way that did not invite water to rest. Whoever had built this house had built the bones of it to last. The door was opened by a woman of perhaps 65, broad and deliberate in her movements, wearing a gray dress and the expression of someone who had expected this visitor somewhat later and had not hurried her preparations on that account. This was Mrs. Haddon, the housekeeper who had remained when the other staff left. She said, "You will want to begin with the east wing," and stepped aside to let Marlowe in. And Marlowe understood from the particular emphasis of the remark that the east wing was where the trouble was. She did not begin with the east wing. She began, as she always began, with the structure, the entrance hall's plaster ceiling, which was Georgian and largely intact, with water staining at the northeast corner that spoke of a roof issue above the second floor. The staircase, which was oak, solid, with balusters of a turned pattern that she recognized as mid-18th century, several replaced with later work of slightly narrower gauge, the kind of patch that occurs when a household was already in reduced circumstances and could not source an exact match. She walked through the ground floor rooms with her notebook open and a soft pencil in her hand, not yet measuring, not yet opening cases or examining individual pieces, but taking the full inventory of the whole before allowing herself the particular pleasures of the specific. This was a discipline she had learned early and kept strictly. An appraiser who rushes to the interesting object in the corner misses the pattern that tells her how the interesting object came to be there. In the long drawing room she stopped at the east wall, where a large landscape in an ornate gilt frame hung between two windows. She did not approach it. She looked at it from across the room, which is where a painting first tells you what it is. The frame was the right period for the house. The canvas proportions were consistent with a mid-Georgian decorative commission, but the way the light fell from the lower left, and the particular blue-gray of the distant hills, and a quality in the brushwork at the tree line that she could only describe, to herself, in the privacy of her own attention, as a kind of earned quietness. Lodi estoy first to work, then she moved on. By 4 o'clock the light was failing and she had covered the ground floor. She had not yet opened Crewe's ledger. There was a reason for this, and it was entirely methodical. She intended to form her own impressions before she allowed his categories to occupy her thinking. An inventory, in the wrong hands, is not a record of what is present. It is a script for what a viewer is expected to notice. She knew this. She had been taught it by a woman she would think about, in time, when the story demanded it, and not yet. Mrs. Haddon brought tea to the library, a room that smelled of old leather and coal dust and something underneath both. A sweetness that Marlowe traced, after a moment, to a small pile of cut apple on a saucer on the windowsill. She asked about it. "For the mouse?" Mrs. Haddon said, without embarrassment. "Does the mouse have a name?" "I call him Crew," Mrs. Haddon said, and returned to the kitchen. Marlowe drank her tea and opened the ledger, and she began to read Aldous Crew's careful, detailed, entirely misleading account of what Ashmore Hall contained. The story must go back now, before it can go forward. It must go back to a house in Leeds, some 12 years earlier, to a narrow room above a workshop that smelled of pine resin and linseed oil, where a girl of 19 sat at a bench beside a woman of 70, with silver hair and hands that had learned to be still. The woman was Dorothea Vane, Marlowe's grandmother, and she was not a woman of many words. She had, in the course of a long life spent examining what other people had accumulated, arrived at a small number of convictions that she stated plainly and did not repeat. The one she returned to most often, and the one Marlowe would carry into every room she ever worked in, was this: the object does not lie. People arrange things. They catalog things. They attribute things. They date things and price things and lose the receipts for things. But the object does not lie if you have been taught to ask it the right questions. Dorothea had been trained in the continental method, in Antwerp and later in Vienna, in the years when provenance research required reading Latin and the ability to move through a private archive without disturbing its arrangement. She had returned to England, married a minor solicitor who died young, and had spent the remainder of her working life as one of perhaps 4 women in the country, doing the work of appraising inherited estates, a trade that was not glamorous, that was not often documented in the chronicles of professional success, and that rewarded, more than any other quality, the ability to sit with uncertainty and wait for it to resolve. She taught Marlowe to read construction joints and examine dust accumulation and distinguish between patina that has grown over a century and patina that has been applied in an afternoon. She taught her to identify inpainting on a canvas, to assess the consistency of a maker's marks against known examples, to weigh the particular quality of wear that comes from genuine use against the kind that comes from abrasion. She taught her, above all, to write everything down, because the record is the proof, and the proof is the only thing that survives a man who has decided to disagree with you. Dorothea died when Marlowe was 23, leaving her the tools of the trade, the practice, a small library of reference works, and the name. She left her something else as well, though this is the thing that does not appear in any ledger. She left her a particular quality of attention, patient and accurate and entirely without vanity, which is not a thing you can inherit in a document, but which passes between 2 people across a workbench over years and becomes, in time, indistinguishable from character. Marlowe had worked for 9 years after Dorothea's death, building a practice of her own, taking estates others considered difficult, building a reputation that moved through the profession by word of mouth among people who preferred accuracy to flattery. She was not without clients. She was not without income, though both were modest. She was not, in the conventional understanding, without connections, though hers were the kind that were not discussed at social dinners. An archivist in Edinburgh, a restorer in Bristol, a retired customs officer in Portsmouth who had spent 40 years developing a detailed understanding of which objects had left England through legitimate channels and which had not. The late Duke of Ashmore, Frederick Vane, 5th Duke, no relation to Marlowe's family except by the coincidence of a common surname, had been Dorothea's client years before. When he died, his solicitors, following his explicit written instruction, had written to Marlowe. The instruction was characteristically spare. Marlowe Vane knows the difference between what a thing is worth and what it has been told it is worth. Give her the house. Let her find what Crew has done with it. She had been given the house, and the debt, and the inventory, and she had come north to begin. What she knew about Aldous Crew, and had not said to Lord Ashmore in that cold office, 3 years prior, in the course of appraising the Pennington estate in Shropshire, she had encountered a set of silver that had been catalogued as Sheffield plate, domestic, late Victorian, value modest, and had recognized it as sterling, London-made, 1743, maker's marks consistent with Paul de Lamery's workshop, value not modest at all. The records of its last documented location, before the Pennington inventory, placed it at Ashmore Hall. Aldous Crewe had prepared the Pennington inventory. This was the knowledge she kept flat and patient in the way of a provenance document, and she had kept it through the interview with Lord Ashmore, and she would keep it a little longer still. The village of Ashmore Crossing had 800 inhabitants, and the collective temperament of a place that had seen prosperity arrive and depart sufficiently often that it no longer rushed out to meet it. When Marlowe walked into the village on the third morning to purchase a larger measuring tape and an additional notebook, she was received with the particular courtesy extended to outsiders who have not yet demonstrated whether they are useful or inconvenient. The woman at the stationer's took her money without conversation. The man at the ironmonger's spoke only to confirm the price. She did not expect otherwise. She bought what she needed and walked back. The difficulty began that same afternoon, when she attempted to access the house's outbuilding records at the estate office, a small stone building at the edge of the stable yard that was nominally managed by a man named Silas Oak. Oak was Crewe's local representative, or had been, in the years when Crewe still made his annual visits to prepare the inventory updates. He was a man of perhaps 50, with a ready smile that he deployed with considerable precision, most often at moments that would have been improved by a sincere expression. He informed Marlowe that the outbuilding records were in the course of being organized and would not be available until Crewe had completed his final review. Mr. Crewe's commission ended at the Duke's death, Marlowe said. He is completing a final review, Oak said, smiling, for the sake of continuity. I see, Marlowe said. She thanked him and left, and in her notebook, under the heading she reserved for administrative observations, she wrote, Oak, records withheld pending Crewe. Duration of obstruction to be measured. The measuring began to matter when, 3 days later, she discovered that the secondary outbuildings did not correspond to Crewe's listed structures. He had catalogued 3, a stable, a coach house, and a garden store. She found 5, including a small stone room accessible from a locked door in the east wall of the stable that was not on any plan she had been given. The lock was old but well oiled. Someone had been using it. She did not attempt to enter. She documented the door, its dimensions, the type of lock, and the fact that the stone threshold had been worn smooth by regular foot traffic, in the manner of a door that opens often and is not meant to be noticed. She photographed nothing, because she did not yet have her camera equipment from London. She measured everything. She wrote it all down. There was one exception to the village's general silence, and it arrived on the 5th day, in the form of an old man named Walter Thresh, who appeared at the kitchen door while Marlowe was eating lunch, and asked Mrs. Haddon whether the new appraiser would want to see the barn. Mrs. Haddon asked Marlowe. Marlowe said yes. She followed Walter Thresh across the yard to a timber-frame barn that Crewe had catalogued as an agricultural outbuilding, contents nil value. What it contained, in addition to the expected detritus of an estate improperly maintained, was a set of 12 oak chairs with carved backs, stacked against the far wall under a canvas that had kept them in reasonable condition, their construction joints and carved detail consistent with late 17th century work, their seats replaced at some point in the 19th, but the primary frames entirely original. Crewe's ledger described them as Victorian reproductions, value decorative. Walter Thresh watched her assess them in silence. When she had finished, he said, "That's what I thought too." He had been employed at Ashmore Hall for 41 years, he told her, as groundskeeper and then as general laborer as the estate reduced around him. He was now retired, in the sense that no one paid him, but he had continued to come in because the place required looking after, and he was the only one left who knew it. He spoke in short declarative sentences, the way a man speaks when he has long since learned that additional words are additional opportunities to be misunderstood. He told her which rooms had been used regularly in the decade before the Duke's death. He told her that Crewe's visits had taken place in May, always in May, and lasted never more than 2 days. He told her that the locked room in the stable wall had been in use for at least 15 years, that he could witness to, and that Oak had the only key. He told her one other thing, as they walked back across the yard in the thin winter light. The old Duke knew, he said. In the end, he knew and he couldn't prove it. He paused. He was hoping you could. That was the moment the weight of the commission shifted for Marlowe, from professional to something older and less categorizable. She did not show this. She said, "He made a reasonable choice of instrument." Walter Thresh looked at her for a moment and then made a sound that was, in the manner of a man who does not laugh easily, the closest available equivalent. He went back to his work. Marlowe went back to hers. She had been at Ashmore Hall for 3 weeks when Lord Ashmore arrived. He came without prior notice, which she noted as a social choice rather than an oversight, in a carriage that arrived at 10 in the morning, when she was in the long drawing room at the top of a ladder, examining the upper right corner of the landscape with a jeweler's loupe. She heard the carriage. She finished what she was doing, made her notation, descended the ladder, and was standing with her notebook when he came through the door. He was wearing a different coat than he had worn in London, lighter, more country in its cut, and he had arrived, she observed, without a secretary or a companion, which was not what she had expected. She had expected him to bring a witness. "You are measuring the paintings," he said. "Among other things," Marlowe said. He looked at the ladder, the canvas, the array of reference books and measuring equipment she had arranged on the side table. He looked at the notebook she was holding. He had the air of a man who had arrived expecting disorder and had found something else, and did not yet know what to do with the adjustment. "Crewe's inventory lists this as a school piece," he said. He was looking at the landscape. "Decorative. A follower of Wilson," he wrote. "Yes," Marlowe said. "I read his notation. You disagree." She considered whether to answer fully. She decided on precision rather than reserve. The underpainting is visible at the lower edge where the varnish has thinned. The technique of blocking in the distance, the recession of those hills, is not characteristic of Wilson's workshop. It is characteristic of Wilson himself. The brushwork at the tree line is not decorative. It is resolved. She paused. Crewe would have needed a loupe and perhaps 20 minutes of attention to determine the same thing. The painting has been here since at least 1773, when it appears in a letter from the third Duke to his factor as a new acquisition for which he paid considerably more than one pays for a school piece. A silence followed this. Lord Ashmore looked at the painting for a long moment. "You have found the third Duke's correspondence," he said. "I have found the library," Marlowe said. "It contains 30 years of estate correspondence that Crewe did not list." He turned to look at her again. This time the look lasted long enough to be considered an event rather than a habit. She returned it with the same steady, workmanlike attention she had offered in London. The balance between them shifted. In this room, by a degree she chose not to measure aloud. "I will require a full report," he said. "You will have one," she said, "when it is complete." He left within the hour, but Marlowe observed as she climbed the ladder again that he had spent several minutes looking at the painting after she had turned away from him, and that he had taken nothing from the room and returned nothing to it, and that whatever he had come to confirm, he had not confirmed it. Now I want to say something to those of you who are still here, in this middle of the story where the ground is beginning to shift. This is the kind of telling that cannot be rushed, and I am grateful you understand that. If you have not yet subscribed to the channel, I hope you will consider doing so now, not because the numbers matter, but because this is the kind of story that grows over time, and there are more coming that I think you will want to hear. What is about to come due has been building since Marlowe first opened that ledger in the solicitor's office, and it is nearly time for it to be paid. Let us return to Ashmore Hall, now, in the deep cold of January, when the elms along the river have lost the last of their bark to the frost, and a door that should not exist is about to be opened. The locked door in the stable wall was opened by a locksmith from the nearest town who arrived at Marlowe's request on the 14th of January, accompanied by a county magistrate named Reeves, whose presence she had arranged through correspondence, methodically and without hurry, over the preceding 3 weeks. Oak was not present. Oak had been absent from the estate office for 4 days, having apparently found pressing business elsewhere in the county, shortly after Marlowe had submitted a formal request, in writing, for the outbuilding keys. The request had been addressed to the estate solicitor, to Lord Ashmore's secretary, and to the county records office simultaneously. This was not the action of a woman who intended to be denied a second time. The locksmith opened the door in 6 minutes. The magistrate made a note of the time. Marlowe went in first. The room was small, perhaps 4 meters by 3, with stone walls and a single narrow window facing north. It smelled of wax and something older underneath, the particular mineral smell of objects that have been stored in proximity to each other for a long time, insulated from the weather by the simple mass of good stone. Along the shelves that lined 3 walls there were objects arranged with the careful impersonality of a pawn shop: ceramic wares, small bronzes, a set of watercolor miniatures in oval frames, 2 parcels wrapped in linen that she did not yet touch, and, on the lowest shelf, a series of cardboard folders holding what appeared to be a substantial number of documents. On the floor beneath the shelving there were 3 tea chests, sealed, their sides stenciled with the name of a shipping firm from Bristol. The tea chests were more recent than the rest. The stenciling was clear and unweathered. They had not been there more than 2 years, she estimated, and she noted this carefully, because the 5th Duke had died 18 months ago, and the question of when certain things had begun to move, and where they had been intended to go next, was a question for the magistrate rather than for her. She measured the room. She counted the objects on each shelf, without touching them, and described each one in her notebook with the precision of someone who understands that an informal list made now will form the foundation of a formal record later. The miniatures she recognized immediately. They were the Tyndall portraits, a set of 8 oval miniatures on ivory, attributed to Andrew Plimer, that Crewe had listed in his ledger as lost, presumed sold before the 4th Duke's time. They were not lost. They had been stored in a locked room, in the dark, for an unspecified number of years, while the ledger maintained their absence as a fact. She did not say this to the magistrate. She wrote it in her notebook and closed the cover. Outside, she stood in the yard while Magistrate Reeves supervised the ceiling of the room. The sky was pale and hard with cold, and the river below the rise was the color of pewter. Mrs. Haddon brought tea to the stable door in the way she brought everything, without comment, without ceremony, with the efficiency of a woman who has long since learned to supply what is needed without being asked. Walter Thresh stood at the corner of the yard with his hands in his pockets, watching. He said nothing. He did not need to. He had said his part weeks ago, and the rest was documentation. The documentation took the form of a report, produced over the following 3 weeks, that ran to 47 pages and contained, as appendices, 17 pages of cross-referenced comparisons between Crewe's annual inventory updates and Marlowe's own survey findings, organized by category: paintings and drawings, furniture and case goods, silver and metalwork, ceramics, documents and manuscript materials, Other portable property. The report identified 39 objects that appeared in earlier estate records and were not present at the hall, matched by documentation to their last confirmed location, and, in 11 cases, to their current location in other collections, or in the inventory of an auction house in Bristol, with which Crewe had a long-standing commercial relationship. It identified 8 objects present at the hall but absent from Crewe's inventory, including the oak chairs, the Wilson landscape, and the correspondence archive. It documented the locked room and its contents with the precision of someone who knows that precision is its own form of argument. And it noted in a section at the end that was quietly but unmistakably the most consequential part, that the tea chests in the locked room contained documentation of a series of transactions, evidently conducted in the final 2 years of the 5th Duke's declining health, that bore Silas Oak's signature and Crewe's letterhead, and that totaled, in the aggregate, a sum that exceeded the declared debt on the estate by a considerable margin. Lord Ashmore came to the hall the day the report was delivered to the solicitor. He had not been summoned. He arrived, as before, without announcement, and found Marlowe in the library replacing the correspondence archive into its proper order, a process that required her to spend a great deal of time on the floor between stacks of documents. And he stood in the doorway without speaking until she was ready to speak to him. He had learned in the weeks since his previous visit to wait. "You found the letters," he said. "They were here," she said. "They required organization, not discovery." He came into the room and stood near the desk. He picked up one of the reference volumes she had been using, a thin, overworked copy of a catalog from a major auction house, its margins dense with her penciled annotations, and set it down again with something that was not quite care and not quite its opposite. A habitual absence of attention, a person might have said, learning to become something else. "The matter of the debt," he said. "The matter of the debt is addressed in Section 4 of the report," Marlowe said. "I have read Section 4, he said. "You are saying the estate was not insolvent. The estate was made to appear insolvent. I am saying that what I found and what the ledger says do not correspond, and that the discrepancy can be accounted for in a number of ways, some of which are matters for a magistrate, and some of which are matters for a probate court." She paused. "I am also saying that the Wilson is not a school piece." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the library windows, the winter light was beginning to fail toward 4 o'clock, and the river beyond the elms was catching what was left of it. He had the look, she observed, of a man receiving information he had half expected and had still not entirely prepared for. Not surprise, but a kind of calibration, the adjustment of a person who has been wrong in a specific way and is deciding what to do with that. "You knew this before you came," he said. "Not all of it, but you knew about Crewe." "I had reason to inquire further," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "And the debt, the £4,000. She set down her pencil. "The debt, as I have documented, appears to represent approximately 1/3 of the liquid value of what was removed from this estate between the years noted in Section 4 of the report. I am not a solicitor. I am not a magistrate. I am an appraiser. What I can tell you, as an appraiser, is what the house holds and what the ledger says the house holds, and the difference between those two numbers." "Yes," he said, "I see the difference." He left the library then, but he paused at the door, in the particular way of a person who has something to add and is deciding whether it requires adding. He said, without turning around, "My cousin trusted you with something he valued." "He trusted the method," Marlowe said. "The method is not mine. I was taught it." He considered this, then he left. The reckoning, when it came, was conducted in the manner of the best kind of justice, quietly, thoroughly, with paperwork and without raised voices. Aldous Crewe, when confronted with Marlowe's report and the contents of the locked room, did not rage or deny. He sat in a solicitor's office in York, a different solicitor's office from the one in London, colder, with less carpet, and looked at the 47 pages and the appendices and the cross-referenced comparisons, and said, in the voice of a man who has spent years being the person who held the document and now finds the document held against him, "I see." He said this 3 times, at intervals, as his own solicitor conferred with him. The magistrate was present. Marlowe was present. Lord Ashmore was present, standing near the wall, not near the door, in the way of a man who no longer needs the proximity of an exit. Oak had been found in Bristol, and had been found in a condition of financial activity that did not improve his situation, and was represented by a separate solicitor who conferred separately, in a separate room, in the manner of a man whose situation requires considerable independent attention. The charges were set out by the county's legal apparatus without any theatrical assistance from Marlowe. She had given the magistrate her report and her annotated comparisons and the documentation from the locked room. The legal apparatus did the rest. The auction house in Bristol cooperated once it became clear that the alternative to cooperation was a more thorough investigation of all their recent consignments. 11 of the 39 identified missing objects were recovered. Of the remaining 28, documentation established their provenance and their movement clearly enough that compensation could be calculated. The debt of £4,000, as Marlowe had predicted in Section 4, was not the debt. The debt was Crewe's. The most consequential event of the reckoning was not dramatic. It occurred 3 weeks after the York meeting, when Lord Ashmore came to the hall for the 3rd time, this time with notice, this time at the invitation of the estate solicitor, and signed the documents that formally restored the encumbered titles, cleared the falsified liabilities, and acknowledged the hall's true assessed value, which was, by Marlowe's survey, considerably greater than the value at which it had been listed for sale. The hall would not, it followed, be sold. There was a pause in the solicitor's progress through the documents while this was absorbed. Lord Ashmore looked at Marlowe across the table. He said, "Then you are not required to leave." She said, "I was not required to stay either." He looked at her for a moment in the manner of a man rearranging a prior certainty. He signed the next document. Marlowe declined to pursue the full extent of what could have been pursued. There were 3 additional objects in Crewe's documented history of transactions that could have been connected to the hall with more work, more time, and more legal machinery. She chose not to connect them. She wrote a note to that effect in the file, and left it with the magistrate, and closed the matter. Walter Thresh, when she told him, said, "He's done." She said, "He is." Thresh nodded and went back to work. He had begun, in February, the process of addressing the box hedges along the drive, cutting them back with a steady and unhurried intention, restoring their original line. It was spring before the elms got their leaves back, and it was spring before Marlowe finished her survey, and it was spring when Lord Ashmore came to the hall for the last time in this particular chapter of its history, and stood in the long drawing-room under the Wilson landscape in the morning light. The painting had been cleaned by a conservator from London, and it was considerably more itself than it had been in its varnished dimness. The hills in the distance resolved now with a clarity that made the room feel larger and cooler, and, in some way that Marlowe had thought about in the private intervals between cataloguing, more honest. Lord Ashmore stood and looked at it for a long time. Marlowe was at the side table, returning the last of the reference volumes to her satchel. The brass clasp was still worn thin. He said, "The old man used to say something. My cousin, he said the object does not lie, if you know how to ask." He did not look at her. He was still looking at the painting. Marlowe's hands went still on the clasp. "That was my grandmother's line," she said. He turned then. "I know," he said. "He told me. Before he died." A pause, the kind that is allowed to run a little past comfort, and thereby become something other than a pause. He said you were the only person he had ever met who knew how to ask. She looked at him in the level, workmanlike way she looked at everything, and what she permitted herself to feel in that moment she did not permit herself to display, in the way of a woman who has held certain things privately for so long that the holding has become a kind of care. She said, "He was a generous man." He took a step toward her. He did not speak again. He put out his hand, and she looked at it for a moment, and then she set the clasp of the satchel to rights, and she took his hand, and neither of them said the thing that was said. Outside, the elms had their leaves, and the river was running high with the spring melt, and along the drive the box hedges stood in straight and patient lines, and Walter Thresh moved slowly along them with his shears, cutting what had grown beyond its proper shape, leaving everything that had always been sound. The object does not lie, if you know how to ask. It never did. It never does. Thank you. Thank you for sitting with this story from its cold beginning to its warm ending, for following Marlowe through that solicitor's office, and the rusted gate, and the long rooms and the locked door, and for staying patient through the middle, which is where the important things happened. If you found your way to this channel recently, please subscribe, because there are more stories like this one, and I would hate for you to miss them. I would love to know where in the world you are watching from right now, whether it is morning or night, whether the window beside you shows a garden or a city, and I would love to know what this story made you feel, or whether it reminded you of anything in your own life, a place, a thing, a person who knew the value of something others had overlooked. Leave it in the comments. I read every one. And when you have left your comment, perhaps ask yourself this: is there something in your own life that has been catalogued incorrectly? Something whose true worth is still waiting, patient and unchanged, to be properly named? The days that followed the signing of the documents were, outwardly, unremarkable. The hall did not transform overnight into the place it had been in the portraits. The high-ceilinged rooms were still cold in the mornings, the roof above the northeast corner still required a mason, and the garden beyond the drawing-room windows was still in the particular condition of a thing that has been neglected long enough to develop its own ideas about what it wants to become. But there was a quality in the air of the rooms that had not been there in November, and it was not warmth exactly, because the fires were no more reliable than they had ever been, and it was not order exactly, because Marlowe's survey materials were still distributed across the library table in a pattern that made sense to her, and to no one else. It was something closer to the quality a room acquires when the people in it have stopped pretending to each other, and this quality is not dramatic and does not announce itself, and it is, in Marlowe's experience, the most reliable indicator that something real has begun. She spent the first week of March completing the formal valuation, the document that would be filed with the probate court and the county records office and the estate solicitors, the document that would stand as the authoritative account of what Ashmore Hall contained and what it was worth. This was the most precise work of the entire commission, assigning figures to each object, not the estimates that serve for preliminary surveys, but the considered, defensible, cross-referenced valuations that must survive scrutiny from any direction. For the Wilson landscape, she had by then obtained a written opinion from a curator at a London institution who had examined her detailed photographic documentation and her notes on the underpainting and the provenance letter from 1773, and who concurred, in careful academic language, that the attribution to Richard Wilson himself was supportable. For the oak chairs she had the comparanda from 2 auction records and a note from the furniture conservator in Bristol, who had examined the construction joints and confirmed the late 17th century dating. For the Tyndall miniatures she had the Plimer catalogue and her own notation of the enamel work on the reverse, which was signed, faintly, in the manner of a man who did not need to shout his identity to those who knew how to look. She worked through the evenings with Mrs. Haddon bringing coal for the library fire, and the mouse the housekeeper called Crew, moving with small, precise confidence along the baseboard behind the shelves, occasionally appearing at the edge of the lamplight, regarding proceedings with the philosophical composure of a creature who has occupied a house through several changes of management and intends to outlast them all. Marlowe had, by this point, left a small piece of apple on the saucer herself, on the 2 evenings when Mrs. Haddon forgot it. She did not remark upon this to anyone. Lord Ashmore came on the 3rd Saturday of March, and this time he stayed for 3 days. He brought no secretary, no solicitor, no document requiring a signature. He walked the house with a different quality of attention than he had brought to his earlier visits. Not audit, not assessment, but the slow reacquaintance of a person learning to inhabit a place rather than merely to own it. He had known the hall as a child, he told Marlowe one evening in the library, when they were both reading by the fire. He had visited twice with his parents, and both times the house had been in better condition than he had found it last autumn, and both times there had been that painting in the drawing room. He had looked at it as a child and not known what it was, only that it was different from the other paintings, that it made a kind of quiet that the others did not make. She listened to this without interrupting. When he had finished, she said, "That is what attribution means, when it is functioning correctly. The eye registers it before the knowledge catches up." He looked at her with the expression she had begun to recognize in him, not the careful neutrality of the London office, which had been a kind of professional armor worn as a matter of habit, but something more open than that, with a quality of attention in it that she did not examine too closely, because she was a thorough and methodical person, and she preferred to verify before she concluded. "You were taught to see that way," he said. "I was taught to look," she said. "Seeing follows from looking, if you look long enough and honestly enough. My grandmother said it was merely a question of time and attention. And what does your grandmother's method say about people?" It was the nearest he had come to a direct inquiry of a personal nature, and she noted it, and she did not deflect it. "The same," she said. "If you look long enough and honestly enough, a person will tell you what they are." He was quiet. The fire settled. Outside the library windows, the night was clear for the first time in several weeks, cold and very still, and in the stillness the river below the rise made a sound that was barely audible, a low, continuous note, the sound of water moving over stone in the particular way it moves in early spring, when the volume is high and the current is steady. "I owe you an observation," he said at last. "You owe me nothing," she said. Nevertheless, he did not look away from the fire. "When I saw you in Fenwick's office, I made a determination before you had spoken a word. I decided before you opened your mouth that you were a minor complication to be managed politely." He paused. "I was wrong in a way that is somewhat difficult to account for, given that I consider myself a careful man." "Careful men make the same errors as careless ones," Marlowe said. "They make them more neatly." He looked at her then, and the look had something in it that she thought might be, in a person who had not spent a lifetime managing his expressions, a smile. "That is your grandmother's line as well." "No," she said, "that one is mine." The formal report was submitted on the 21st of March, and the spring quarter brought with it a series of administrative resolutions that Marlowe tracked through the letters that arrived weekly from the solicitors, each one reporting another step in the orderly disintegration of Aldous Crew's arrangements. The auction house in Bristol had agreed to a settlement that funded the recovery of several of the missing objects and provided compensation, properly structured, for the others. The documentation from the tea chests had proved sufficient for the magistrate's purposes, and the legal proceedings had moved from inquiry to charge to a proceeding in the county court with a brisk efficiency that Marlowe found, professionally speaking, satisfying, not because the punishment was severe, because it was not, but because it was accurate, and accuracy was, in her experience, the closest available equivalent to justice. Oak received a lesser charge, consequent to his cooperation. He was not absolved. He was reduced, in the precise and administrative fashion of a man who has been found out by paperwork rather than confrontation. And there was a quality in this outcome that Marlowe thought the late Duke would have appreciated. The quiet, thorough kind of consequence that does not make speeches, that simply closes doors. She allowed herself, in the privacy of one evening's solitary walk along the river path while the hawthorn was beginning to show its first small leaves, to think about Frederick Vane and what he had done, and what he had known, and what he had trusted her to find. He had known, in his final years, that the house was being quietly emptied. Walter Thresh had told her this, and the documents confirmed it. Certain entries in the Duke's private letters that Crewe had not found because they were not in the library but in a lacquered box in the bedroom that Marlowe had catalogued in her second week, showed a man who understood that something was wrong, but who was too old and too tired, and too poorly supported to press the matter alone. He had made one final methodical decision, which was to leave the house to the one person he knew could ask it the right questions. This was not a dramatic act. It required no audience. It was the act of a man who trusted a method more than he trusted the people around him, and who was, in the end, entirely correct. Walter Thresh passed along the path in the opposite direction as Marlowe was returning, his jacket open despite the chill, his secateurs in his hand. He paused. He looked at the hawthorn she had just been examining, and then at her. "Found everything?" he said. "Everything that matters," she said. He nodded once, the nod of a man for whom a great deal has been, in one sentence, adequately summarized, and continued along the path. She watched him go and thought that the most useful people in any situation are almost always the ones who have been there longest and speak least. Lord Ashmore was in the drawing-room when she came back to the house, standing before the Wilson landscape in the afternoon light. He had been doing this, she had noticed, with increasing frequency, returning to the painting the way a person returns to a thing they are in the process of deciding about, not the object itself, but what the object has come to mean. She came into the room and stood beside him, not near enough to be presumptuous, near enough to be present. They looked at the hills together for a moment. "I have been thinking about what you said," he said, "about the eye registering what it does not yet know." "Yes, I think that is what happened," he said, "with this," a pause, "and with other things." She did not ask him to specify. She understood that he was a man of considerable self-possession who was, at this particular moment, being as direct as he was capable of being, and that demanding more directness than a person was built for was not generosity, but its opposite. She said, "The light has changed it, the cleaning." "The cleaning revealed it," he said. "It was always what it was." She looked at him then, and he was looking at her, and the light from the west-facing windows fell across the room with the particular quality of late afternoon in March, when the sun is still low, and the shadows are long, and everything is illuminated from the side, rather than from above, which is the light in which most things are most accurately seen. She put her hand out and he took it, as he had taken it once before, and this time neither of them released it. The small mouse that Mrs. Haddon called Crewe appeared at the baseboard beneath the east wall, moved with its customary confidence along the length of the room, and disappeared behind the wooden surround of the fireplace. Mrs. Haddon, who had come to the doorway with tea and had taken the scene in at a single practiced glance, set the tray on the side table without announcement, and withdrew in the manner of a woman who has lived long enough to know that some rooms should not be entered at certain moments, and who has the professional satisfaction of a person who has waited quite some time for a thing to become what it was clearly going to become. Outside, along the drive, the box hedges stood in their restored lines. The river was audible faintly from the upper rooms. The elms were coming into leaf, not fully, not yet, but there was a green suffusing the gray of the branches that was not there last week and would not be stopped. Walter Thresh was moving somewhere beyond the stable yard, his footsteps quiet on the wet ground, doing what needed doing, as he always had. The hall stood on its rise with the patient solidity of good stone, indifferent to the years that had passed and those that were coming, holding what it had always held. The portraits, the landscape, the chairs with their carved backs, the correspondence in its proper order, the record of what things were and what they had been declared to be, and the difference between the two numbers, which was, in the end, not simply a matter of value, but a matter of truth, of the kind that endures not because anyone has defended it loudly, but because it was written down, and measured, and set in the record, and left to speak for itself. The object does not lie, if you know how to ask. It never did. It never does. Thank you for following this story all the way to its quiet and honest end. I am genuinely grateful you were here for it. If this is your first visit to the channel, please do subscribe. There are more stories like this one waiting, and I would not want you to miss them. I would love to know where in the world you are watching from today, and what this story moved in you, or whether it brought to mind a place, a person, a thing whose worth was overlooked for too long. Leave it in the comments. I read every one, and I mean that. And before you go, I want to leave you with one question to carry. Is there something in your own life that has been catalogued incorrectly? Something whose true worth is still waiting, patient and unchanged, to be properly named?